Dr. Welcome to the third part of the Network Capital podcast. You've been gracious with your time, and we've now, I'm pleased to say, crossed 3 million downloads for both for the first part of the podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into your last years at UN and your foray into the Indian political system.
Right.
Could you please tell us what you were thinking? You'd already walked us through your journey in the UN. Why did you want to become the UN head at that time? What were some of your goals, and how did you prepare yourself for that challenge?
Well, in a sense, I thought my entire working life, which was pretty much my entire adult life, because I joined the UN at 22, that essentially was a preparation for the top job. I was in a very unusual position in that I would have been one of the very, very, very few people who would have actually done everything that a Secretary General needed to know about the UN's work in the course of my career. I had done humanitarian work, I had done political work, I had done peacekeeping work, which at that point was the biggest responsibility facing the UN. I had worked in the Secretary General's office and seen a lot of the diplomatic contacts with heads of state and government around the world. I had understood all the issues. I had done management and budget as the head of the largest department of the UN. I had done reform, where I had to streamline the organization, cut the organization back and conserve resources. I had done public information, communicating the messages of the organization to the world. So in many ways, mine was literally the most perfect imaginable resume for the job of Secretary General. I say this with a laugh because, of course, that's not how it works.
But you also had a really strong network, Dr. Tharoor. We discussed that last time. Through your work, because everyone knew about it, you also had a strong network. Isn't that right?
Well, I mean, I obviously, once you get to the level I'd got to at the UN, I obviously had frequent and friendly dealings with all the ambassadors of all the countries, the main countries, and less with lower ranking diplomats below the ambassadors. I think, you develop a reputation fairly quickly within the organization, as well as with its partners, interlocutors, its the diplomats accredited to it. So by the time 2005 rolled around, with elections due in 2006, a number of ambassadors started popping up in a very friendly way and asking me whether I would consider contesting. In fact, I still remember a couple of ambassadors from small Asian states saying that looking around, they couldn't think of an Asian better qualified, that for Asia to get its turn, which was due, that turn couldn't be better fulfilled than by me. I was very flattered, but I smilingly replied to all of them that, as you know, I'm an international civil servant, and that indeed the only way that you can contest for this job is to be invited to do so by a member state, to be nominated by a member state.
Right.
And I had no particular reason to believe that the government of India, which was my country, had any reason, any desire to put forward a candidate. So I didn't take it too seriously, but the thought had been expressed, and therefore it had begun to come into my mind that this is something that a lot of very credible countries and ambassadors were beginning to think of as a realistic prospect. It's relatively unusual for a career civil servant. In fact, the only career civil servant from within the UN without any extensive governmental career behind him to become Secretary General was indeed Kofi Annan, who was then the incumbent. So it seemed a long shot, and I didn't give it much thought until in September of 2005, when he came for the General Assembly. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh asked me himself, would you be interested in contesting? And at that point I said, well, if you nominate me, I'll certainly be interested. And he said, what do you think the challenges are?
Did he know you at that time? Like, had you worked together?
No, he and I knew each other. Not well. We knew each other in Geneva, but I was with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and he was heading the South Commission, which was an economic development organization. So we didn't work together at all in any way. But obviously, amongst the Indian expatriate community in Geneva, there would be gatherings in which we would meet, and so I'd seen him socially in the second half of the 1980s when he and I were both in Geneva. I left Geneva in late '89. I think he may have left slightly before that. He went on to have a very distinguished career in India, during which I only met him once when my book, Nehru, The Invention of India, was published in 2003. And Murli Dera, who insisted on hosting the launch of that book in Mumbai, invited Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was then the leader of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha, to come and be the person who would launch it and make a speech. And he made a wonderful speech, and I enjoyed the evening with him, and we had dinner together at Murli Dera's home afterwards. So that was a renewal of friendship, but I can never pretend it was a close relationship. Then when he became Prime Minister and came to New York in 2004, as usual, of course, as the senior Indian, I was brought out by the UN to greet my head of government.
Right.
But he was gracious beyond that, invited me to lunch in his hotel room and discussed everything. I remember having a number of very frank conversations with him at that time, and we had become fairly friendly in the course of that. But I did not presume, for example, on a visit to India to call on the Prime Minister. I had no particular business to raise with him, and though I did come to India in 2005 to speak, I was honored by St. Stephen's College with the request to deliver the 125th anniversary lecture, so I had to come to Delhi for that. I still didn't make it a point to call on the Prime Minister. I felt it was not my place to do so, to intrude on a busy man. Nonetheless, when he came in 2005, we met again, and this time in a very formal meeting with his National Security Advisor, M.K. Narayanan, by his side. He's the one who raised the subject, and that's when the conversation began. So he asked me what I thought the challenges would be, and I said I thought the principal challenge would be China, and the principal opportunity would be the US, because of India's very friendly relations with the US. India was negotiating the Indo-US nuclear deal at that time, and I said, if you talk to a couple of the key countries, you'll get a sense of what's going on. The Chinese are the ones I don't know about.
And now, is that how it panned out?
No, this is September of 2005. Between September and December, the issue went nowhere. And I began to feel that the government had just floated the trial balloon and dropped the idea. I did have ongoing conversations with the National Security Advisor, and once or twice with the Prime Minister by telephone. And it was clear that with the Prime Minister, there was now a note of uncertainty about how to take this forward. So what I suggested was that the best thing was for the Prime Minister to ask President Bush himself. He was due on a state visit to India in February of 2006. And Mr. Narayanan thought that was a very good idea. But as it happens, the issue was not raised because at that point, the negotiations on the Indo-US nuclear deal were very complex, very serious. And I think that for the Prime Minister, he didn't want anything else to interfere with those discussions. And so the issue never came up. And I don't say this with any note of reproach. I fully respect the priorities of the government. But I think that may have been the last opportunity we would have had to let the Americans in on our intention to present a candidate. So in February, nothing happened. At that point, I gave up and I assumed nothing was going to happen. I was asked, however, by Mr. Narayanan and by the...
I would imagine it would have been so pleasant.
Listen, the problem at that point was that it wasn't pleasant, but at the same time, I had no real basis for expecting it. I wasn't a government servant. I wasn't an Indian politician or an Indian bureaucrat. So I had no entitlement to expect anything from the government, and I didn't act as if I was entitled to this. So don't worry, I wasn't that fragmented or torn at that point. But then I was asked by the Prime Minister to speak to the Foreign Secretary, Shyam Saran, and one thing that was agreed at that time was that it was important to test what the Chinese felt about it, because the expectation on the part of the Foreign Ministry also was that an Indian candidate might attract a Chinese veto. So I thought that was a legitimate concern, and I was asked to do this essentially on my own the government did not want to be the ones broaching this with the Chinese. So I called the Chinese permanent representative, Wang Ya, and I said, listen, Ambassador, I have to ask you something rather sensitive. I'd like to make a visit to Beijing and to meet the foreign minister. He said, yes, of course, no problem. I said, no, wait a minute. This is not an official UN mission. I'm not coming on the UN's dime or on the UN's time. I will be taking leave and coming on my own ticket for a particular purpose, and I'll tell you what I'm coming for. I've been asked to consider the possibility of contesting for Secretary General, and I wanted to speak to the foreign minister about what the Chinese government's view was. And I'm telling you what my intention is and why I want to come, because if China doesn't want to receive me on that subject, I will get the signal. I'll get the message, and that should be the end of that. So that's how diplomacy is conducted. You don't, directly do these things. So I said, fine, I'll come if you understand this is why I want to come, and that I'm not coming as a UN official, and I'm not coming on behalf of the government of India. I'm coming in my own steam. So he said, fine. A few days went by. Then he called me back, and he said, I've spoken to the foreign minister, and I've been instructed to tell you that you're most welcome to come to China. We look forward to seeing you. When are you coming? To which I said, I hope it's very clear.
Wasn't that surprising for you?
It was. And I said, I want to make it very clear. I'm not coming on behalf of the UN, nor am I coming on behalf of the government of India. He said, in that case, we will send a car to the airport to meet you. And so I used up, as I remember, all my frequent flyer miles to fly to Beijing for 24 hours. I was taken straight from the airport by a foreign ministry car to a meeting with the foreign minister from the moment I landed. I must say it was an amazing conversation. It was meant to be a 15-minute appointment. It went on and on in the end for an hour and a half, during which he was interrupted a couple of times by people passing him notes, no doubt telling him his next meeting was waiting. But he moved them away, shooed them away, and continued talking. He had been China's ambassador in France, so he suddenly and abruptly switched to French to test my French.
So switch to French from English, or
from English? We couldn't speak.
Well, you never know. You speak Bangla. I mean, my partner was really surprised to hear that.
Anyway, so we spoke in English, and then because it was a one-on-one conversation, he could have done it the formal Chinese way with an interpreter, but he preferred to talk to me one-on-one. Right. And then, I beg your pardon. I think he did actually have an interpreter. I'm sorry, he did have an interpreter. But he switched to French. We had a good conversation in French. He was suitably impressed by my French, told me it was very good. And then, with a mischievous smile on his face, he said, clearly all you need to do now is to learn Chinese. And then he pulled out a piece of paper and started scrawling some characters in Chinese, saying, this is your name in Chinese or whatever. I wish I'd kept that page, but it was a tremendously warm gesture. And at the end of the conversation, he said, you can convey to your government the following message, and he said that in English. I remember those words explicitly in English. China will not stand in your way. And I took that as a very clear signal there would be no Chinese veto. China will not stand in your way. And I very confidentially wrote up a detailed account of the conversation and sent it to Delhi. The foreign secretary was surprised and pleased about this. And undoubtedly it was conveyed to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. Right. I've forgotten which month this was. I think this was about March or early April. And then again, there was complete silence. And the complete silence was a bit unnerving for me, because having gone this far, I thought there'd be some signal for me, listen, we've decided not to go ahead, or we are going ahead, or whatever. Nothing. And I remember I was in Washington for some other meeting on a day in June, late June, when I got a call out of the blue from the Foreign Secretary, Chamsaran, saying, I want to let you know we are announcing your candidacy today. And I said, I beg your pardon, look, at least give me 24 hours to get back to New York, prepare, tell my boss, and so on. Don't do this. He said, I'm sorry, the press statement has already gone out. This is the way in which India works, I guess. So while I was in Washington at this other meeting...
Was the intention to pleasantly surprise you or shock you, or none of the above?
I can't speak for other people's intentions. All I can say is that's how the announcement came.
Right.
And obviously there was a huge story in India. We never put forward a formal candidate. The Vijayalakshmi Pandit's name had been discussed briefly in the early 50s. We'd never put forward a formal candidate for the Secretary Generalship. So suddenly, there was this whole frisson of excitement in India. At the UN, I had to tell Kofi Annan that this was my situation, that I was finding myself in the same position he had been in 10 years earlier. He gave me his blessing, but said, "You do understand I can't endorse you, because then I'll be taking sides amongst various candidates." I said, "I fully understand." I started getting calls from all sorts of people, and to my pleasant surprise, a lot of people showing some enthusiasm and excitement for this. In a short while, in a few days, I was invited by the government of India, this time at their expense, to visit Delhi, to meet the Prime Minister formally as the anointed candidate, meet the various political leaders to make sure we had everyone's support, which I did in the last week of June. It was a very good visit. Former Prime Minister
support do you really need, Dr. Tharoor? We are all unfamiliar with how this actually works.
No, I would say on this one, I had enough reason to believe that Sonia Ji, the Congress Party president, was supportive, but the decision had to be made by the Prime Minister's office, and I think it was left entirely to the Prime Minister to take the final call. I know Mr. Narayanan, the NSA, was enthusiastic. I know that the foreign ministry bureaucrats were considerably less so, and I don't blame them. That's simply the way things are. I think Sonia Ji certainly was consulted and made it clear that she was quite happy with the idea. But the final call came from Dr. Manmohan Singh. And it's possible that the way things work, once the Prime Minister, having considered all the pros and cons, decided to go ahead, at that point, the government machinery swung quickly into action. There was no time for further notifications and consultations. But when I came to Delhi, I saw everybody. I did see Sonia Ji. I did see the ministry, senior officials, including the ones assigned to steward my campaign. I saw the leader of the opposition, Mr. Advani. I saw Mr. Vajpayee. I saw the communist leaders, Mr. Karat and Mr. Yechuri. I saw the ministers from coalition allies of the government. Memorable conversations with the likes of Lalu Prasad Yadav and so on. I saw the president, the Rashtrapati Abdul Kalam. It was an extraordinary range of contacts the government organized for me. And I did the round of all the television channels. It was quite astonishing for me to sort of discover the Indian media that way. And that was a time when everyone from Barkha Dutt to Arnab Goswami, believe it or not, was extremely generous in phoning over me, and we had some very, very good shows. So it was sort of a triumphal visit to India for 3 or 4 days, following which the Indian government arranged for me.
Did that help your candidature in any way?
No, that merely showed up the national backing for it, because to have Vajpayee Saab's blessing and Advani Saab's blessing, as well as the communist blessing and the Congress UPA allies blessing, meant that it was not going to be an object of domestic controversy. That was the important thing that was achieved by my visit, nothing else. But also, of course, I had to familiarize myself with the ministry, who all in the ministry would be directly associated with my campaign and so on. And one of the things we immediately decided in the first few days was to get the African Union, the Organization of African Unity as it still was, to invite me to address their summit on the subject of the UN election, which Ban Ki-moon, the South Korean candidate, and the Thai candidate had already been slated to address. There were other candidates, but not all of them were planning to come to Banjul in Gambia to address the OAU. But I agreed to go. In fact, I thought it was a welcome opportunity. And of course, I was the only one who was able to address the OAU in both languages, English and French. I delivered a speech half in English, half in French, and that was quite a hit. But there already we got the inklings of some of our problems, because at that point, the Chinese attending the conference were certainly quite overtly unfriendly, and the Indian diplomats accompanying me began to pick up signs that the Chinese were poo-pooing an Indian candidacy to some others. Nonetheless, we did that. Soon after that was the first ballot. We hadn't, the candidacy had been announced very, very late, in that Mr. Ban Ki-moon had been candidate since the previous September. The Thai candidate had been announced even earlier. Sri Lanka had put forward Jayanta Dhanapala. Afghanistan was putting forward Ashraf Ghani, who subsequently became president. We had there were only 2 candidates of the 7 in the fray who entered after me. One was the president of Latvia, who thought that the Asians being divided, she might get through.
Right.
And the other was a Jordanian prince, who's also a friend of mine, Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who later became the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. But it was a stellar cast. It was a top-notch cast of characters in that race, and I was particularly gratified
and you
when
almost won.
In the first ballot here, I came within 2 votes of Ban, which I think totally took aback the Indian diplomats who had not expected me to do so well. And it made everyone wake up and take things seriously. There was also indications from the Chinese that they had voted for all the Asian candidates on principle, because they said their only interest was in ensuring that an Asian should be Secretary General. So I think that the Chinese had not at that stage abstained in my case. But only remember, this is an election of just 15 countries. So it's not, unfortunately, an election with the General Assembly where a country like India has a fairly strong backing amongst a large number of member states from Asia, from Africa, from the developing world generally, the G77, the non-aligned movement, all of that gave us a strong thing. This is an election only in the Security Council, because the way these elections work is that the Security Council will put forward one name and only one name to the General Assembly, and it's always ratified by the General Assembly without any serious challenge. There is no previous example in all these 75 years of the UN's existence of the Council putting 2 names and asking the GA to vote. The General Assembly is purely a rubber stamp in this process. It's a Council election. So we knew the battle was entirely within the Council. Anyway, there were 4 ballots, but only in the 4th ballot, which took place in early October, I think it was Mahatma Gandhi's birthday or a day before, only in that 4th ballot was a different colored ballot paper given to the permanent members. And the reason for this is very clear. In the Security Council, the permanent members have a veto. And so it doesn't matter if you've got a couple of votes against you from non-permanent members. They might eventually change their minds. But if you have a veto-bearing member state who is vetoing you, then you have a problem. I think when we spoke last time, I mentioned the Kofi Annan situation.
You did,
where the French vetoed him until the last round. But he didn't drop out because all the other candidates had somebody or the other vetoing them also. And that's when a deal was struck with the French and the French veto was lifted. Whereas in the 4th ballot, Ban Ki-moon had no veto-wielding power against him, and I did have one. Only one. One veto-wielding power voted against me and one abstained. It was pretty clear that the abstention was China, because they had promised they would not stand in my way, quote unquote, they would not vote against me, and they kept their word. The veto-bearing power, however, was the US, and though it was subsequently revealed in any case to the world in an indiscreet memoir by the then US representative John Bolton, I did get a call just before the vote from Nicholas Burns, who was the Undersecretary of the State Department, who was actually spearheading all of this, to say that the US had decided to go for Ban Ki-moon. So I was not surprised. I was aware that this was happening. In the memoir,
the reason is also alluded, right? Why they wanted not a strong candidate.
That was Bolton's thing. I'm told by some other people that it may not be in subsequent editions of the memoir, but it was in the first edition and occasioned a lot of comment at that time when he said that his instructions from Condi Rice were that we don't want a strong Secretary General. I think there were other factors as well, as I pieced together afterwards. I had very good relations with large segments of the US establishment, ironic, not with Mr. Bolton, but I knew many others. And though I knew Condi Rice superficially, we should have got a clue from the fact that she never agreed to see me as the Indian candidate. That is, that whenever the Indian ambassador asked for an appointment for this purpose, it was politely referred to somebody else, Nicholas Burns usually, and so on. So we should have got a clue. But in any case, I discovered later by talking to very many senior officials who were very friendly to me, that the ultimate calculation for them was that the Koreans had made a huge issue of this from the very start. That is, from the announcement of Ban's candidacy in September the previous year, so a full year earlier, they had made a very strong pitch that this really mattered to Korea. The US ambassador in Korea had traveled to Washington to say that, we have so many issues between us and President, I think his name was President No, I think, of Korea, that we really need to give them things that don't matter to us. And who cares about the UN? Let's give them this guy. That was one message that I gather was conveyed to Washington. And at the same time, because India was focused on the Indo-US nuclear deal, and we didn't raise this till many, many months later, the perception was that this didn't matter as much to India as it clearly mattered to Korea. So we won't lose anything if we don't give this to India. We will lose something if we give this to the Koreans. And that factor was a very major one. In addition to the Bolton factor that we don't want a strong Secretary General, because there, I had a very good friend, I'm sure he won't mind my indiscretion now. He was the senior American in the UN. As I was Under Secretary General, he was Under Secretary General for Administration and Management. And he was very close to Bolton and very close to the Republican Party establishment. He wasn't a civil servant. He was a manager who had been brought in by the US government to take that job. And he told me, listen, what I'm hearing from Bolton is no more Kofis. And the problem with Kofi at that point was that he had attracted a lot of enmity in Washington by saying that the 2003 invasion of Iraq was illegal under the UN Charter. That word got a lot of people riled up. And they felt that anybody with the capacity to address a world audience above the heads of governments and thereby challenge governments was undesirable in a position which could do them some particular damage, whereas Mr. Ban was seen as a much safer bet because he was not particularly given to articulation in any of the UN languages that they were worried about. So all of these things, somebody like me was probably just not the kind of person that US administration at that time would have wanted. And that's also the luck of the draw. I mean, if the Clinton administration had been 6 or 7 years later, it may have been a very different story, because they're the ones who strongly backed Kofi Annan, and they're the ones who batted for his reappointment well before it was even due. But in this case, the Bush administration didn't want that kind of Secretary General, so that was that. It was over, and we ended up with the result we got. Absolutely no hard feelings. I thought, some things are worth doing merely because they're the right thing to do, and I felt that mounting that candidacy and losing was better than never to have tried at all and always spending the rest of your life wondering, what if I had done this? I might have been so much better, whatever. Here, I tried, I lost. It gave me actually a lot of peace. I was consoled by the Bhagavad Gita's argument that you really need to be focused on the act without expectation of reward. The reward was indeed not available. And I had one new challenge, which was to reinvent a life that, had it not been for this race, was actually quite predictable for the foreseeable future. That is, I was an Under-Secretary General of the UN, but I was also a career civil servant, which is not true of most of the Under-Secretary General, who are so-called political appointees. And therefore, I had a valid contract that would have kept me going at the UN till 60. In fact, the retirement age had just been expanded to 62. And in fact, before I hit 62, the UN expanded the retirement age to 65. So actually, at the time that I had lost the Secretary Generalship at the age of 50, I didn't know that I had 15 years of a UN career left if I wanted it. But I just felt it was not right to stay. Ban, who knew me earlier, was gracious and invited me to remain, at least on a one-year contract as Under Secretary General, heading one of the field operations. And I thought about it very briefly and thought, no, that wouldn't be right. Because at the end of the day, having contested for the top job and failed, anything that I were to say or do would cast a shadow over the Ban administration, in the sense that if I did something better than him, it would be a reflection. People say, oh, he should have been there, etc. If I did something that was objectively critical, it would look like sour grapes on my part. If I did something that was supportive, they'd say, how hypocritical. I mean, it just was a no-win, I thought, to remain in those circumstances. So I just very politely accepted 1 month to be able to tie up some of my loose ends and plan my next steps, and I quit the UN at the end of March 2007. 1 month short of 29 years in my UN career. And I look back on a very satisfying 29 years. You and I have talked about many of the reasons why it was satisfying, not all of them, but many of them. And therefore, I was able to march out of the place with head held high. And I was quite determined not to go back, because I felt that one of the things I had been very struck by when I was a young official was the number of very many senior UN people, often legends of their time, former Undersecretaries General, who would come almost cap in hand to relatively younger and mid-ranking officials like myself, asking for consultancy contracts and assignments during their retirement. And I thought nothing could be more humiliating. I won't name the people, because these are people who deserve all the respect they earned when they were on the job. But to see the way some of them behaved after retirement was for me deeply, deeply embarrassing. And I vowed as a young man that I would never be caught dead doing what they were doing. I would never go and ask anybody at the UN for a UN assignment. And so once I walked out, the only time I ever went back to the UN twice, once was as Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India, leading the Indian delegation. We have different delegations and different leaders throughout the General Assembly session. So after the Foreign Minister had come and gone, I went in the second week heading the delegation there, met Ban Ki-moon, who had won, had a very amicable handshake in front of the UN and the Indian flags. That was my one visit, and spoke for India in a number of committees and so on in the General Assembly, which was very satisfying for me. And then the second occasion I went back was when I was invited by the UN and by the Norwegian government, which had just renovated the Security Council chamber, for a commemorative seminar on the role of the Security Council a year later, where they invited only one non-UN speaker, and that was me. It was a great honor. So I went off there. I didn't stay very long. I think I stayed 1 or possibly 2 days as a guest of the UN, and spoke at the Security Council, met Ban again, of course, and others. But apart from those two official purposes of being in, I haven't gone back to the UN, and I have no regrets about that. I have very fond memories, and I want to keep them that way.
And lots of impact as well that you created, which which has hugely been inspirational for young millennials around the world. After this, Dr. Tharoor, you had a brief stint in the private sector, and one thing that we've heard you talk about was that it was fun, but you learned something about yourself. What was that, and what was the stint with the private sector?
Well, I think we talked about the fact that I got into both the IIMs after college, and I leapt at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy instead. And the reason for that was that I never thought that the prospect of selling soap and detergent for a Hindustanized multinational was ever going to appeal to me. Right. When at 50 I was suddenly out of a job, I decided not to look so skeptically at the private sector, because at least it would help pay the rent. So I decided to accept an offer from an Indian businessman based in Dubai, who spent his entire career in the Arab world, and particularly in the UAE, but who wanted to explore the possibility of expansion to India. And he thought that with my name recognition and so on, I could open some doors for him and explore some prospects, both in India generally and in Kerala in particular. So that sounded like an interesting assignment. I took it on. I worked for a little under 2 years, a year and a half or so, with him, during which I made fairly frequent visits to India, and within that, very frequent visits to Kerala. I went to Kerala in the end about a dozen times in those less than 2 years, mainly because he had, with hindsight, a slightly crazy idea to set up a modern state-of-the-art steel plant. He'd been trading in steel and so on in Kerala, which had not traditionally been known as being hospitable to industry of any sort. But I conducted many of the discussions, and I had been somebody who had kept links with people in a friendly way, irrespective of party. The communists were ruling at that time, but I had good relations with the industries minister, Elamaram Karim, who's now a Rajya Sabha MP. I had good relations with, I met the first secretary of the Communist Party, who's now the Chief Minister, Pinarayi Vijayan. So I had established links and dialogue with all these people. Thomas Isaac, the finance minister then and now, became a friend. And in fact, he even wanted to discuss with me the prospect of becoming a sort of goodwill ambassador for Kerala. but I kept saying, let's keep that option open. I'm not sure what I'll do, etc., because I didn't want to be associated necessarily with one political party at that point. So, to cut a long story short, I kept going in and out, and during these visits, whenever I went to Delhi, which was not on every visit, Kerala was much more frequent, I would make it a point to make courtesy calls on the people I knew. That included Jaswant Singh. By then, Shri Vajpayee was a little unwell. I didn't think it was right to trouble him. I did see Advani Saab once. I saw Jaswant Singh Saab a couple of times, Yashwant Sinha Saab, who had also been foreign minister, and I'd known him there. And I saw Sonia ji fairly frequently, and she was particularly friendly. She asked me to deliver the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture in the year 2007, I believe it was, or possibly 8. I was the person who delivered that lecture. I had met her earlier as well, speaking at a seminar for the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation in the late 90s. And I had also spoken to her when she had visited New York and the UN as part of her familiarization visits when she became leader of the party. So she wasn't a stranger, but we became friendlier then. And in any case, in early 2009, the conversations began to veer towards a fairly serious interest on the part of the Congress party in me, in which at one point I was considered possibly for a Rajya Sabha seat. There were other priorities at that time that didn't happen.
Were you interested in that, Dr. Tharoor?
Look, I was certainly interested in contributing to India one way or the other. And the Rajya Sabha seat that was being discussed was a nominated seat, not a political party seat. In fact, in the course of 2008, I'd actually been invited by the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, Somnath Chatterjee, to a round table of eminent citizens. There were 8 or 9 of us, including Narayana Murthy, the film director Shan Benegal, and others, to discuss the functioning of Parliament and to share with us his frustrations with the way Parliament was going and seek our advice as eminent citizens. So, I've been taking an interest in all of this. I even was invited by the Speaker to deliver a lecture in the Parliament Library on terrorism after 26/11 for the benefit of MPs. And I did so. I think there were only about 40 MPs showing up and a lot of staff. But still, I had not been, I had kept connected, as it were, to the political process, to parliaments in all these ways. But don't forget, the Speaker was a communist. I had really not shown any political credentials at that point to any particular party, and my books had been equal opportunity offenders to everybody. I had been critical of the BJP, critical of the Congress, and critical of the communists for various reasons at various phases. But I had, as I think we haven't talked about this, I had begun to think very positively about the Congress after 1991. I'd been a staunch critic of the failings of the emergency, of the excessive state control of the economy, over-bureaucratization, etc., etc. And I had not minced my words in my earlier writings. If you read my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, you'll see quite a lot about that in the early years. But from 91, with Manmohan Singh's liberalization, I really began to feel that the Congress party had actually freed Indians from some of the burdens of the colonial past, as well as the burdens imposed by the statist approach of previous years, and that now Indians were going to grow and flourish. In the course of the UPA first term, I could see how much tremendous progress was being made in pulling Indians out from below the poverty line. I was talking regularly with Dr. Manmohan Singh, his peace initiatives to Pakistan, I was in the loop on, because as the Undersecretary General for Public Information, I had the job at the UN to chair any press conference by a head of state or government. And Mr. Musharraf, unlike Dr. Manmohan Singh, insisted on holding a press conference every year. And whereas on the first year, the Pakistani ambassador asked specifically that it should not be me, because I was an Indian citizen from a hostile country, etc., by Musharraf's second press conference, the Pakistanis had got around to asking specifically for me. They said it'll send a very good signal that an Indian is chairing the press conference of the Pakistani president. So as a result, I was having, 15 minutes with
keeping controversy out and being a
that, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And I did all of that, but I conducted I conducted the conference very fairly. I didn't overly favor Indian journalists against Pakistanis or whatever. I gave also, but I also had an opportunity to talk to President Musharraf several times in the process, because we met backstage, as it were, behind the podium for 10-15 minutes before and after. And so in doing these briefings, I had this access. And so on a couple of occasions, the Prime Minister of India actually conveyed a message through me to sort of convey a signal of assurance that he was serious about his initiatives. And the President of Pakistan did the same back through me. So there was actually a very, shall we say, I had a good ringside view of the sincerity of both individuals in the early days of their dialogue. Of course, I left the UN the beginning of 2007. These press conferences are the time of the General Assembly. So after that, I couldn't handle them. And in 2006, because I was a candidate for Secretary General, I didn't do that press conference. Kofi had asked me to take leave without pay by then, so I didn't do Musharraf's press conference. But in 2004 and 5, I had done so, and those were the 2 years in which Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mr. Musharraf had exchanged messages through me. So anyway, I'm just saying that we had all of the stuff going, but when I had a good opinion of the Congress Party, that didn't necessarily mean that I was going to have a political career, because I knew that somebody of my background really didn't have any scope in politics. But to my surprise, I beg your pardon?
Did you think that should you contest, you would have a real shot at winning? Or was that thought not even there?
To be honest, I knew so little about it that I didn't really have a clue. But I did feel that I would have to pick my battlegrounds carefully. So I was asked by the then head of the Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee, Ramesh Chanithala, whether I'd be interested in contesting. In fact, we were speaking Malayalam to each other. My Malayalam was still very rudimentary, and I didn't understand the word he used for contesting. So I said, why not, in order to buy time, and then I was going to check with friends, what does this word mean? So I said, why not? And he said, oh, that's interesting, or something, and we left the conversation, and later asked a friend, what does this word mean? And he said, it means, would you be interested in contesting the election? Oh, I said, he didn't use the word election. He said, but that's what the word means. And I said, oh boy, well, it looks like I've given them a signal that I'm interested in contesting the election. But that message clearly traveled up the chain. If you ask me when it was, I can't tell you, but sometime probably very early. I'm sorry?
Do you remember the word?
It's Malserikya. Malserikya means to compete or to contest.
I see.
And Malserikyo was the word he used. Would you contest? Right. And I really wasn't sure what he meant. And he didn't say, will you contest the next election? He just said, will you contest? And I had to kind of guess. So anyway, to cut a long story short, with that, I think the news of my interest began spreading within the party. To my utter astonishment, the Congress District Committee in Palakkad, which is where my parents' ancestral villages are located, passed a unanimous resolution asking the party to put me forward as the candidate there. And I was a bit taken aback, but I did a little bit of quick research and homework and consulted people from Kerala. And I thought that would turn out to be a very bad idea for me to agree to, because in fact, though my parents' villages were in Palakkad district, they were not in Palakkad constituency. They were in a neighboring constituency called Alattur, which was reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So I wouldn't even be able to use my home address, which was still the permanent address on my passport, as my base. I would have to rent a place in Palakkad town. I would not really be calling on the home base support, the village support, etc. Secondly, Palakkad is a small town, principally agricultural. And I thought that inasmuch as I would stand a chance in electoral politics, it could only be amongst people who'd heard of me. And I was more likely, I thought, to have a following in a more sophisticated, bigger town with a readership. All my books to that date had been translated into Malayalam, so other people who read my books in Malayalam at least, people who know about me, who I am. That will give me a leg up, but in a predominantly rural constituency, which was at that point known to be a stronghold of the CPM, I didn't think it was going to be such a good idea. So when the conversations reached the level of the Congress president, and she asked to see me, and I called on her in Delhi, I said very frankly, thanks, but no thanks. I don't think this is a wise idea for these reasons. I gave her the reason I just gave you. So I said, the only two cities where I think I'd have a chance are Kochi and Thiruvananthapuram. Kochi, I know you always, all parties normally run a Christian candidate. It's a Christian plurality town. But Thiruvananthapuram, my being a Hindu and a Nair, is not a disadvantage. So I'd like to be considered for Thiruvananthapuram. Now, I was still taking a risk because the two previous elections in Thiruvananthapuram, the seat had been won by the communists. So it was not that I was asking for a safe seat, but nonetheless, it was the capital of the state. It was a prestige seat. There were some doubts about it. And I won't name him, but a former minister of the Rajiv Gandhi government, or maybe even the Narasimha Rao government, who had meanwhile left the party and then returned to it and was angling for that seat, sent Mrs. Gandhi pages and pages that she showed me with a laugh of extracts from my earlier writings that have been critical of the Congress party, saying to her, how can you name a guy who's been said such nasty things about the Congress party to a ticket? But she laughed about it, saying that, if you're sure you want to fight under our banner and you support what we stand for, we'll ask for you. But anyway, I still said no to Palakkad. I left a very clear signal that if Thiruvananthapuram was offered, I was prepared to take it, but they could not give any commitments. I fully respected that. Mine was not, as far as I know, one of the three names submitted by the Pradesh Congress Committee for Thiruvananthapuram. They made it clear they wouldn't mind having me for Palakkad, which was considered a lost seat anyway. So that's often what happens in politics.
Agree with your analysis. They thought that you're still more suited for Palakkad fight.
No, I think the calculation is very simple. That Palakkad is a lost seat anyway. No congressman was likely to win it. If Shashi Tharoor pulls off a miracle because of whatever magical appeal, then it's a bonus for us. If he loses, we lose nothing because we're going to lose our seat anyway. I mean, I think that was honestly the calculation. And in the three elections since, we have continued to lose that seat, except this election 2019, when we had a whitewash almost in Kerala, defeating the commies in every seat bar one. So we won Palakkad, but otherwise Palakkad was considered a very difficult seat. Anyway, I'm not being cynical about this. There were also, frankly, some very favoured members of the party in good standing who wanted the Trivandrum seat, other than this unfortunate minister. So I think in all fairness, it was pretty clear at that point that I was not, shall we say, the person whom the party wanted. But Mrs. Gandhi and the High Command decided otherwise. It was literally at the last minute. I got a call the day of the announcement of the candidacies that I would be the candidate. I rushed to Kerala, and when it was announced,
place to
nothing. I had nothing. I had this a businessman friend who happened to be from Thiruvananthapuram, and his friends were the only people I could talk to. And his friends were from all sorts of walks of life. One guy was a journalist, was the son of a communist leader. Another guy was a business executive who was the nephew of a communist leader. And none of them were particularly well-known Congress people. So it was a huge. Anyway, I had agreed to do this, so I went in. But it became very clear I hadn't a clue what I'd bitten off. I would have to say that election campaign in 2019 was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And it was packed into an intense 3 weeks. I was told on one day, I've forgotten the exact, something like the 19th of March. I think 20th was the last day for filing of nominations. And the campaign started, and 3 weeks later, voting took place. So it was an intensely insane 3 weeks, during which, and of course, I just was essentially cast into the hands of the Congress party machinery, because they knew how to run elections and I didn't. I attracted a rather unusual motley crowd of non-politicians. Apart from my Thiruvananthapuram businessmen's friends, there were people who volunteered from the outside world. So I had a UN colleague who just retired who came. An ILO colleague who had not retired took leave and came and campaigned, even though he didn't know a word of Malayalam. He was a Punjabi. I had a banker and securities trader who took 4 weeks leave to come and be with me, and so on. So there were half a dozen.
This became your war rooms.
They became my backstage war room. We couldn't present them to the Congress party. Congress wouldn't recognize them, but they did all sorts of things that the Congress party was not used to doing. They helped run a website for me. They helped liaise with the national and international journalists who were fascinated by this campaign. So we had such a large number of journalists descending on my constituency, and we had English speakers who were able to deal with them. We had all sorts of unusual things to do. Playing escort services to visiting foreigners, trying to write up English language press releases, which no one in Kerala politics had felt the need to do before that, etc., etc. Not writing tweets yet, because at that point my Twitter account existed but was not being actively used, since I hadn't fully mastered the art. And I think there were all of 10,000 Twitter users in the whole of India or something at that point. So it wasn't exactly, or not even 10, maybe 3 or 4,000. So it wasn't exactly a major medium. But the web was beginning to be one, and we ran a website, etc. Anyway, to do all of this was amazing. But what was very tough was the hours. The campaigning hours officially ended at 10 p.m. But the party in those days disregarded that and said, "We'll switch off the mic in deference to the Election Commission, but you go on campaigning." And I shouted myself hoarse talking without a mic till midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. many nights. Then I would get back to my home, collapse, exhausted, and have to be up again at 5 a.m. for a 6 a.m. start. It was absolutely murderous. The campaign, as I said, the toughest thing I'd done in the hottest month of the year. And that too in a profession I knew nothing about from the inside. I'd never even seen an election campaign. In fact, I'd never even voted, because I left India at the age of 19, and those days the voting age was 21. Since India doesn't give a vote to its overseas residents or its NRIs, I had never voted, and I'd never seen an election close up. All I'd done was read about politics, which I was fascinated by, and write about politics. But this was like being, the famous theory of throw the kid into the swimming pool and he'll either sink or swim. That's what happened to me. I began swimming frantically. And I must say that I had lots of hostility from within the party. Some members of the party burned my effigy when my candidacy was announced, because they were backing other faction leaders. One faction leader deliberately gave me the toughest possible itinerary, because he wanted me. In fact, he was said to have said to somebody else, "You watch, this guy will drop out within 3 days and we'll get somebody else before the nomination withdrawal date." Somebody else said, "Let's see whether he's got what it takes. We'll put him." Anyway, so it was amazing. I had a really, really tough year. But of course, I also had enthusiastic, supportive young people who welcomed a fresh face, people who were excited by somebody who was a name they'd read in the newspapers suddenly becoming a candidate for them. They had, and of course, the clear signals from Delhi that both Sonia ji and Manmohan ji were behind me. That also energized their loyalists, because I remember once I was campaigning and a campaign worker ran up with astonishment saying, "The Prime Minister wants to speak to you." And we had to stop the vehicle and take a call from the Prime Minister just to ask me how I was doing, how things are going along, wishing me luck and so on. They'd never seen that happen before. So that kind of thing was all very exciting. So there were lots of positives too, don't get me wrong. And I later learned from Mr. A.K. Antony that Sonia ji called him more than once to say, "I hope you're keeping an eye on Thiruvananthapuram. This is a good candidate, we've got to help him win," and so on. So there was certainly a lot of support for me from the top of the party at that point. And to cut a long story short, the election went miraculously well. And I won, not just handsomely, I won by a lack of votes, which at that point was almost a record win in the constituency. Then started my troubles. That was not the end. That was not the beginning of the end of my troubles. It was the end of the beginning. The troubles continued. And I went through a harrowing few years baptism in politics. Everything that could go wrong went wrong.
Into controversy way too much, right? And
I still have absolutely no doubt in my own mind that the controversies were almost entirely unmerited, and that in almost any other democracy, none of them would have been controversies. The notorious cattle class example.
That was hilarious. Yeah, that was really something.
So the government declared an austerity drive. I had already been unjustly pilloried in the media for staying in a 5-star hotel, even though I was doing so at my own expense and out of my own stupidity. I didn't know any better. Whenever I came to Delhi, I used to stay in either the Imperial or the Taj. The Taj offered me a bulk rate for a month kind of thing, which was discounted. So I said, fine, I'll take a suite at the Taj at that price. Not realizing that, of course, as an MP, I could have gone into government accommodation at much more subsidized rates. It was sheer ignorance and lack of familiarity with all of this. But anyway, I was a front page headline in the Indian Express to my horror. saying that I'm living in luxury. And the implication of the story was that I was charging the taxpayers, which I was not. But anyway, so I was then requested by the Finance Minister, Pranab Mukherjee, to leave the hotel, which I did. So when the government declared an austerity drive,
Right.
this BJP-leaning journalist, Kanchan Gupta, sent me a tweet saying, "So, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class?" He used the words, and the words meant something to him, and they meant something to me, because I've been living in the Western world for 30 years, and cattle
Very
class is a very common, banal expression, which means economy class, and it's not meant to disparage the travelers. It's meant to parody the airlines for herding us in like cattle. That is essentially the long and short of the usage. So I replied, I thought wittily, perhaps not so funny with hindsight, yes, I will travel in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows.
Right.
And then I traveled off to Liberia for an official visit as minister, and the dung hit the fan. I mean, you had the most astonishing outbursts in India, with people accusing me in the media and in the political world of disparaging ordinary people, economy class travelers. I was a snooty elitist. I had likened human beings to cattle. I thought holy cows might offend some of the Hindu fundamentalists. In fact, it was cattle class that offended them. So you can, go figure, as they say in America. But the result was that for 2 or 3 days, this was all that the political class could talk about. One Congress chief minister called for my resignation, of all things. And because in those days, mobile phones didn't exist, it took me 24 hours to get to Liberia to find out that this was happening behind my back. And I had to, I'm sorry, mobile phones did exist, I beg your pardon, but I was on a plane initially from here to Brussels, wait there, change of aircraft, Brussels to Accra, change of aircraft, Accra to Monrovia, Liberia. So the whole journey took 24 hours with no communications in between. I was at the welcome reception thrown to me in Liberia by the Honorary Consul General there, that I discovered that all this drama was happening. Anyway, I then dealt with it as best I could. I first of all called the Congress party to ask Mrs. Gandhi if they were genuinely upset at me. She was not. She understood where I was coming from, but she said, I think you better make it clear this is not what you meant, which I did. That, of course, our favorite television anchor felt the nation didn't want to know that. So other things then took over. When I came back to India, the issue was still live, but Dr. Manmohan Singh was finally able to puncture this ridiculous controversy balloon with one sentence to gaggle of press people who asked him questions about it at a Rashtrapati Bhavan reception. He said, "For God's sake, it was only a joke," quote unquote. And that completely deflated the issue, and it was over with that. So anyway, I was told that there were some people in the Congress party who had not welcomed my entry into the government, who had happily and gleefully egged on their friends in the media about this. I will not look back on that entire episode with much pleasure. But as you know, there were 3 or 4 more like that. There was my completely accurate use of the word interlocutor, where I said to a journalist that Saudi Arabia was our interlocutor, and because they have good relations with Pakistan, they were a good interlocutor to have. Whereupon they then alleged that I was suggesting Saudi Arabia should be an intermediary with Pakistan, and thereby upending decades of Indian foreign policy, when I had said no such thing. Interlocutor does not mean intermediary, it merely means the person I'm talking to. So right now, Utkarsh, you are my interlocutor. That's all it means. And it's again a very banal word in diplomatic speak in New York, in UN, but alas, it was not something familiar here. So anyway, I went through controversy after controversy, and various baseless things were, go ahead.
It seems to me that right to be offended has become a fundamental right. Everyone seems to be taking offense on something or the other. And for young people who are listening to this podcast around the world, when confronted with such a situation, what have you learnt? What's your advice to them?
Well, my principle always was that the offended should go and listen to something else, or watch another channel, or buy another book, rather than wanting to ban and burn and block those things that offend them. But that principle is actually not the lesson I learned. I learned that in politics, the wisdom of Shakespeare's famous line that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. That was the principle that one should follow. That it doesn't matter in politics what you think you intended to say. All that matters is what the public believes it heard. And as long as the public can be manipulated by the media into believing that something you said actually makes you into a racist or a sexist or a classist or language chauvinist or whatever else, you will be tarred with that brush, and therefore do not give people an opportunity to tar you. That was the main lesson I learned. And after I resigned from the government, the other thing that happened to me was that I had 2 years of working very hard in my constituency, which would not have been possible if I'd simply continued in the External Affairs Ministry. I had done a good job in the External Affairs Ministry, and as a result, the bureaucracy, which had initially perhaps been skeptical about my appointment, had really taken a shine to me. And in fact, with my resignation, it was striking the number of anonymous senior officials who told a large number of journalists how much I would be missed because I was a minister who mastered my briefs and I did more than justice to their preparations, whether I was answering a question in Parliament or speaking to a foreign minister. And so they missed me. But they therefore had planned a very ambitious schedule for me. The month that I resigned, April of 2010, or May, I guess it would have been the following month, May, I had 29 days out of 31 scheduled for foreign travel. And it's very clear from what I know of Kerala politics that if I'd continued like that, I would never have been re-elected. That's not what Kerala voters want from their politicians. So anyway, I spent 2 years being a very good constituency MP, concentrated on what my constituency needed, spent time there, a lot of time there. And after 2 years, the government appointed me again, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, as Minister of State for Human Resource Development, which was interesting and instructive. I learned a lot about education policy, and I was in charge of clearing all the ministry's responses to Parliament. But I also realized, sorry, just to finish the thought, I also realized that being a Minister of State is absolutely not a good position to be. In the External Affairs Ministry, because their traditions were different, I actually was given specific portfolios for which I was responsible. So I was the minister for the Arab world, Africa and Latin America, as well as for the Hajj pilgrimage and for passports and visas. So all of those things came under me, and I didn't have to refer to the foreign minister to do that. Whereas in every other ministry and all the domestic ministries, the practice appeared to be that the Minister of State essentially had no independent authority, that the minister, the cabinet minister, was the only one who did it. So having accepted this position and the mistaken assumption that I'd get something, either school education or higher education or something, and I'd be able to specialize in that, do a good job. Instead, I was essentially understudying the minister, who was a good friend, Pallam Raju, nothing against him. But as I joked later, when I left the government, when my party was defeated and the new government came in, I issued friendly advice to the ministers of state on Twitter saying that, do realize that being an MOS in the government of India is like standing in a cemetery. There are lots of people under you, but nobody's listening. And that essentially was the experience I had there. But sorry, you were going to ask another question.
No, just on your HRD experience, you have a wonderful speech on education, excellence, and equity, the 3 E's, I think. And I think it's still relevant almost 10 years after. We're going to attach it in the show notes. You continue to win elections. Do you remember which speech I'm talking about?
Yes, it was, I think, for TEDx in Mumbai, TEDx Gateway. Right. And it continues to be popular, though they got the title wrong. I mean, they said, whatever they said was wrong. I was talking about a well-formed mind being better than a well-filled mind, but that's not what they have on YouTube.
Yeah, they flipped it.
They got it wrong. But anyway, I mean, the substance of the speech, the whole speech is there on YouTube. It's been watched by a couple of million people already. And it's a speech that argues for a different approach to education. So as I said, the one thing I gained from that stint in the ministry is a very, very solid, in-depth awareness, because I read my files. I had this good habit of not letting the bureaucrats take you for granted. I did my homework, even though I wasn't responsible for any of the decisions. I really did master the issues fairly well, and therefore I feel that it's an area that I'm competent to speak on with some authority and interest and to write on. But that's another matter. I enjoyed working in bureaucracy, made some good friends in the bureaucracy, learned to respect them. But they're all very brilliant people. I mean, other than the fact that they write very bureaucratic English, which I always used to correct before sending answers to Parliament. So if you look at the answers to Parliament from the HRD ministry during my stint, you'll find there isn't a single use of Babu English, as it were. But at the same time, they're wonderful. You give them an instruction to do something that they don't want to do. and they will smile at you cheerfully. They'll never say no. They'll say, yes, sir. And they will forget to do it. And then you remind them 2 months later, what happened was this done. They say, oh, no, sir, let me see. We can't trace the file, they'll say. And this sort of stuff. It's the bureaucracy is brilliant. And I don't entirely disagree with those who say that by and large, it's the bureaucracy that runs the country. The government can set down the broad lines of policy at the political level, but implementation requires a bureaucratic mindset. And that may be why, or a willingness to challenge the bureaucratic mindset, which I had. But that may be why Mr. Modi has made so many appointments amongst the ex-bureaucrats. It's simply not been there. We've always had a clear distinction between ministers who are politicians and bureaucrats who are civil servants. But now we are seeing in the ministerial ranks, 4 or 5 of the most influential ministers are people who are retired civil servants, which is extremely, extremely unusual. And unlike someone like a Natwar Singh who got elected from his princely constituency, or a Manishankar Iyer who got elected from Tamil Nadu, or myself, these are people who have not even pretended that they have any political base. They have been appointed to the Rajya Sabha and appointed as ministers purely because of their bureaucratic competence. And that is a surprising development in Indian governance, but may well be a foretaste of things to come in the way Mr. Modi wants the country to be run.
Right. I'm just going to take a few more minutes, if that's okay.
We are already 10 minutes over our hour. I hope your listeners will have the patience with Kash, but go
on. My listeners really want to listen to this. You even won the latest election, right? In your constituency. You're the 3-time winner. The last 2 elections have been, you've been fraught with personal and professional challenges, significant ones. Could you tell me how have you managed to overcome those challenges, and what are some principles that helped you transcend the tragedies and the challenges and come out as a winner?
Right. Well, the second election, that is the 2014 election, when the Modi wave was happening, was the toughest because of an unrelated reason. In January, my late wife passed away. People were creating a whole lot of unwarranted controversy and false charges in the voyeuristic media about it. There was, completely without a shred of any evidence, all sorts of lies were being spread. And because of that, there was this insidious whispering campaign against me in the constituency saying, how can you vote for this guy who murdered his wife? And it was something which obviously would hurt any individual, but it was particularly hurtful at the time because I was the one mourning. And whereas the culture of politics had been that you would go to even a political opponent's home to commiserate the loss of a loved one, even a parent, and even an aged parent, here I was being victimized for a tragedy that I had suffered. So it was really, really hard emotionally and personally. But what saw me through was the work I had done in the constituency. And in particular, I would say there were 2 or 3 projects. I had been very diligent. I had used my MP Lads funds well, brought in a lot of small things and so on. But there were 2 big things I was able to do using my connections in the central government. One was I got a number of trains to stop in train stations in my constituency through the goodwill of a close friend of mine who was the chairman of the railway board. This is how it works. I can't even say close friend because he was senior to me in college, but he knew me from those days, and he's the one who helped approve certain requests that might not otherwise have made it. In one particular rural constituency on the border with Tamil Nadu, Parashala, for 27 years have been agitating for a train stop that wasn't stopping. They had a station but no trains, except the trains going through. And I was able to get them 3 express trains stopping in their constituency. And, for a person who was paying 50 rupees for a bus ticket to ride 2 hours from this place, Parashala, to Thiruvananthapuram city, to be able to go in 15 minutes on a fast train or half an hour on a fast train, for 5 rupees, which later became 10 rupee ticket. Obviously, there's no comparison in the level of their gratitude to the MP who delivered this. So that was one thing that helped. But the bigger project was there was a bypass road that had been planned for the constituency from one part of Thiruvananthapuram, an area called Karakotam, all the way to the Tamil Nadu border. The marker pillars had been laid 40 years previously, but for various reasons, the project had never taken off. The project had lapsed, nothing had been done. And I didn't even know about this because I was not a local. But when I was campaigning in my 2009 campaign, the locals came up to me with tears in their eyes saying, listen, we're in a mess here. Thanks to these marker stones, no one will buy our land. No one will even give us a loan against the land. They're saying the government can take your land anytime. So we have the worst of both worlds. We neither have a road, nor can we use the pleasure of the land we own. So either get the whole project scrapped officially so that we can have it, have our land back and we can sell it or whatever, hypothecate it, whatever we want to do, or get the road built because the road is something we all need. So I took that up as a challenge. It was the subject of my very first meeting after my election victory with the then Highway Minister Kamal Nath. I ended up having to see 3 highway ministers to get it included in the UPA budget. Got it included, worked with the National Highway Authority, with successions of bureaucrats from there, spoke to the members in charge, ensured that not only was included in the budget, but that the financial allocations were made in time. And what is more, that all the processes, you see, a road is not just getting a signature on a budget document. There is a whole series of stuff that needs to be done. You need to follow through diligently. For example, a survey has to be conducted. That survey has to be conducted, notified, and objections overcome within 12 months. Otherwise, the project lapses. That's one of the reasons the project has lapsed once before. When I got this approved, I discovered a few months later that the survey hadn't even begun. I tried to find out why, and found all the surveyors had been transferred to other ministries to do other jobs. So I called the revenue minister. Fortunately, by then the Congress was in power in Kerala. So I called the revenue minister and said, for God's sake, boss, you've got to redeploy the surveyors back to the surveyor's office because we have to get this road done. So he was kind enough to help. The surveyors went back. They were going very slowly. With about 3 months to go, they hadn't finished the job. They're looking nowhere near it. I summoned them and read them the riot act with the collector, the deputy tehsildar of the area. I said, listen, I tell you right now, if you guys screw up on this and miss this deadline and the project lapses, I will denounce you from every podium in your backyard. You'll find it impossible to live in this constituency because all the people are looking forward to this road being built are going to be cursing you. You better get this done. I was very tough. They took it on. They worked overtime. They worked Saturdays and Sundays. I think it was done in time. I had a last minute hitch when the MOS, who had to clear the file in Delhi, was away on home leave in Andhra Pradesh for several weeks. I had to actually get an official at my expense to go and find him in Andhra Pradesh and get his signature. And then at the end of all of that, there was a further catch that it had to be printed in the official gazette of the government of India before a particular date, and there were only about 2-3 days to go before the 12 months lapsed. I actually called the press and spoke to the head of the printing press to ensure that this particular item was printed in time to come through. So the project didn't lapse. It happened within the 12 months, just under the wire. Survey results were announced. So diligence, perseverance, detail, all important. But then came my communist opponent saying, this is just an announcement. You just watch. Nothing will happen. It's only on paper. Don't vote for the guy, vote for us, etc. So to get this only on paper tag lifted, I knew I had very limited time because once the elections of 2014 were called, the code of conduct would come and nothing could be done. So I bust a gut to get the first transfers made from the central government to the state government in record time so that the first checks could be handed over. I even called the member finance of the NHA. Bless him, I've forgotten his name now, but he turned out to be a fan of mine who was happy to hear from me because he liked reading my books. And I said, can you do this for me? Can you ensure that the first tranche is delivered to Kerala by Monday? And he said, exceptionally for you, I'll do it. He cleared the file. The checks arrived, and I got the Congress Chief Minister of Kerala, Uman Chandi, to hand over the checks. That was a very deliberate signal because it meant that the BJP, had they won nationally, and the communists, had they won locally, could not have claimed credit. That's what happened. The checks were handed over, and under the code of conduct, once an ongoing process is there, it can't be interrupted. The process went on. The land was acquired. People were happy because they got a good value for their land. I intervened for them. And the commencement of the road construction took place under the BJP government. Of course, the BJP continues to try and take all credit for the road. But the people of the area know first that it started before there was a BJP government. And second, that on over 100 occasions during the last 5 years, at every stage when community objections have arisen, when problems have come up, when people wanted an intersection which the National Highway authorities had not given them, or they wanted an underpass or an overpass and hadn't been built, it was Shashi Tharoor who showed up in the area, met the local people, looked at the maps, summoned the engineers, summoned the contractors, met with the NHAI and got their thing done. So as a result of that, my stock with the local public was very good. So much so that one of the panchayats has insisted on naming one of the junctions after me because they were so happy with my intervention that made that junction possible. And at the end of the day, that road will transform the lives of generations yet to come. And I think it really was a major factor, both in my victory in 2014, the start of the process, and a factor, not perhaps the major factor, but a factor in my victory in 2019, when the road has made very, very good progress, despite lots of glitches on the way, because they've seen my diligently following through on it. In 2019, as I said, it wasn't as tough an election, even though we thought that it would be, because of the extraordinary strength of the BJP government and Mr. Modi's personal popularity. What happened was that there was what we might call a secular consolidation across Kerala, where the threat that the BJP represented to the way in which India had traditionally celebrated pluralist coexistence had become so stark during those 5 years, and particularly in the last year or so of the government, that people who might otherwise have hesitated to vote for me because they didn't like the Congress, they preferred the communists or whatever, or they were liberals, or they were elites and they couldn't be bothered to vote or whatever. A lot of these people said, no, the future of our country is at stake. We need Shashi Tharoor's voice in Parliament, and we need the Congress to stand up against the BJP. And I know some people whose inclinations are overtly communist, who said, no, this time we know that sending a communist to Parliament will not do us any good because there'll be a very, very small force nationally. The Congress, even if it doesn't win the national election, will be the principal opposition. Let's strengthen it, and this is a voice we want to hear. And that, I think, is what clinched the election. I again won by a lack of votes almost in this election. It was announced that I won by over a lack of votes, but then suddenly a whole bunch of absentee ballots from the military showed up in the hands of some BJP people, and they were counted, and that reduced my majority slightly below a lakh, a few votes below a lakh, but it doesn't matter. The symbolic value of the original announcement was that I had matched my victory of 2009 in 2019, and that was immensely gratifying. So I would say, if you ask me for lessons, the lessons are hard work always pays, being diligent to the really important needs of the constituents, being responsive to their problems as and when they evolve, running an efficient operation on the ground, but also using every inch of clout or influence you may or may not be able to command at Delhi to be able to deliver, maintaining decent relations with those who can help you, whether in the bureaucracy, in the center, or even with the ministry. I'm proud to say I have a very good equation with Mr. Gadkari, and he has never played politics with this very important national highway project, even if his local party men in the state have wanted to try and play politics with it. So in every respect, I think trying to get along with people and trying to deliver results is a fail-safe formula for whatever you want to do in life.
This has been fascinating, Dr. Tharoor. May you continue to do the work that you do, and please keep writing. We love to, keep creating your books. I just wanted to tell you before we conclude that this podcast, a lot of our listeners have been saying that you should just combine all of them and create an audio book out of it. So we're going to get that out in the market and get this to you, and maybe you can share it with your folks as well.
Okay, Utkarsh, the one thing we haven't talked about at all is my writing, but on that there's plenty out there on YouTube and on the net, so I hope that people are curious about my books and who didn't get anything about that side of me.
But I mean, I just don't want to be unfair to your time. If you
I can't now, and we've already gone this far. But fortunately, that's one area which is well mined territory. And 90% of what I talked to you about, I haven't talked about anywhere else in the public domain. So That's what makes this different. Whereas pretty much all my books have had extensive media coverage, much of which survives on YouTube. So I would encourage those who are interested in that side of my concerns and my writing to listen to those. Whereas with this podcast, they have got a side of me that I haven't talked about much elsewhere in the world.
Thank you so much for your time. We sincerely appreciate it, Dr. Tharoor.
Thanks, Utkarsh. All the best.